pressure on DR constantly increased from Vancouver to Los Angeles. The naked Playboy sessions began again with more promotional appearances, worries about me in New York and about her family in Vancouver, and Snyder every morning and night. Dorothy had not liked or trusted her mother's new husband, which only helped to increase her tensions. Antonia had left behind in New York a shopping bag full of her things. Back in L.A., Dorothy made a date to take her out one afternoon and return the stuff. They stopped at Snyder's on the way to a movie, and Dorothy introduced Tony to Paul as the director's daughter. Snyder was sitting in the dining room, wearing only a shirt and jockey shorts, rolling joints with a buddy. There were numerous exercise tables around that Snyder had built, and Tony noticed that none of Dorothy's suitcases had been unpacked. With a smirk, Snyder offered Tony a joint and laughed when Dorothy gave him an angry look. She took Tony's arm, and they left. In the shopping bag, Antonia noticed an 8x10 photo of me that I had inscribed to Dorothy. Didn't she want to keep it? DR asked Tony to hang on to the picture for her until they were both back in New York. Snyder insisted on coming along to the Carson show and made a nuisance of himself backstage, but DR managed not to allow him to affect her poise in front of the camera. Months later, I heard that at her request, Snyder and his friends had been banished from the NBC dressing room. John Ritter called and raved about her performance with Carson. She had even managed to score off Johnny, unheard of for a newcomer. And she had been so sweet, Ritter felt, and so charming. When Carson asked her which part of a man's body she liked best, Dorothy paused one beat and then said, "Stand up." It got a good laugh and caught Johnny by surprise, but he liked her for it. He'd stood up, then she picked the chest as her favorite, and Carson said he was insecure about his chest. Later I asked DR what prompted her to tell Johnny Carson to stand up. She said his question had made her angry. She thought he was leading her into one of those vulgar areas for cheap laughs, and the words just came out. Actually, she said, Johnny was very nice to her, very polite and funny. She looked beautiful in her white dress, so excited. She handled herself with both the natural ingenuousness of a newcomer and the self-assurance of a trooper. She even managed, in the most extraordinary way, to tell the truth, but in such an offhand, guileless manner that only a close inspection would reveal its significance, like evidence after a murder. Even as she was carefully alert to Playboy's image, Dorothy nevertheless backed directly into an admission of her real feelings. Johnny got her to reveal herself by first asking what reaction she thought women had to seeing pictures of naked men. Dorothy answered, "Speaking for myself, I think a male is sexier showing a little bit or some in a bikini or trunks rather than fully nude." The studio audience applauded and Dorothy smiled. Carson closed in. "Johnny, I suppose that's true with men, really, you know. The imagination plays a great part." Dorothy, "I think so." Johnny, "And yet you appear here sans everything, right?" Dorothy realized she had been caught off guard and stumbled for the only moment on the show. "Well, there's a difference, I think. Other magazines leave definitely nothing to the imagination." At the close of the program, Dorothy mentioned the picture she was shooting in New York, and when she said my name, her eyes sparkled. DR told Johnny she had just graduated from high school when she was approached by Playboy. She had been working for the telephone company as a clerk typist. Carson was visibly taken aback. "She was putting him on," he said. "No," said DR, "I worked there just 6 weeks before they carried me away." More than 2 years later, I saw a videotape of an edited version of the Playboy press conference that officially announced Dorothy as Playmate of 1980. Hefner did the honors. He himself told me on the phone in New York that she had been trembling during the proceedings, and Dorothy confirmed her nervousness and tension. To me, Hefner dismissed her anxieties as youthful stage fright, and Dorothy seemed to echo that interpretation, but a great deal was left unspoken on both sides. Neither of them mentioned their recent blow-up when Dorothy refused to strike a Hefner-demanded pose for one of the pictures in his screen goddess pictorial. The photo was to be an imitation of Marlene Dietrich straddling a kitchen chair in Joseph von Sternberg's The Blue Angel. Marlene, however, was fully dressed. Dorothy would be naked, and the pose would be explicit. She exploded into angry tears and refused to make the shot. She never told Mario any of the truth about Hefner. Casilli later said to me that Dorothy was the least talkative, most closed-mouthed woman he had photographed in 20 years of girly shots. She never revealed much about her personal life. At the videotaped press conference, Snyder was on the sidelines scowling at Dorothy, while Hefner stood beside her and tried to appear as familiar as possible while still being respectful. He looked a bit anxious and ill at ease, but years of experience helped to conceal his awkwardness. Dorothy was clearly not at ease. Her smiles looked forced. The several glances she threw at her boss were politically friendly, but not genuine. There was an edge of fear in her eyes. Hadn't DR told me as much as she could when she said Hefner always made her feel uncomfortable? Dorothy returned to New York the 3rd week of May. On the first night, I told her there had been several times while she was gone that I thought she might have changed her mind about us. She started to cry and said that if that was how I felt, she really didn't know what to do. She was terribly hurt. She had told me how she felt. She had come all the way back from Canada to tell me. She then described how abusive Paul had been, how he tried to make love to her, and how her flesh crawled, she said, whenever he touched her. She particularly couldn't bear for him to touch her breasts. Dorothy's eyes filled with a kind of sad terror. I had to do it a couple of times, but I'll never do it again. I felt the way a prostitute must feel. I took her in my arms and said it was my own insecurities, not a lack of trust. As the days went by, Dorothy became certain that she was being observed and followed. One day, a man drove alongside her in his car and asked her to meet him later because he needed to talk to her, but Dorothy refused to speak to him. Over several nights of location shooting, I felt a cold gloom on the streets, an angry, dangerous atmosphere I could not pin down. There was the chilly feeling that we were being watched with hostility. Much later, a few months after Dorothy was killed, I found that we had indeed been under surveillance by private detectives hired by Snyder. DR's business managers and the new lawyers I had recommended advised her to allow them to send an official letter of separation to Snyder, but she preferred something less cold. Wasn't there another way to make it legal? Attorney Wayne Alexander told her that all she really had to do was to write Snyder a letter specifically stating her intention to get a separate place to stay upon her return to Los Angeles. That fact in writing was sufficient under the law to effect a legal separation. She wrote and mailed the letter, her last to Snyder, on June 26. "Don't make me afraid of you. A sickness only gets worse if it's not discovered and treated in time." A short while after he received the letter, Snyder went to their bank with another woman and tried to convince the officers that she was his wife, Dorothy Stratton. He wanted to get into her personal account, having already cleaned out nearly $15,000 from their joint account. The bank refused. What was he buying with all the money? Clothes and jewelry for himself, Dorothy was told, but there was more to it that none of us knew. Wasn't Snyder heavily into cocaine, which was very expensive? Weren't friendly doctors helpful for good money in obtaining the best grade of coke and many other drugs? Didn't Snyder have a regular drug connection? Snyder tried to get Patty Lorman, his new blonde 17-year-old Stratton look-alike, to take a joint and some cocaine, but she refused. Although their relationship remained platonic, Snyder held her hand in public so people would believe otherwise. Hadn't Snyder also used Dorothy's earnings to hire detectives in L.A. and in New York to keep an eye on his wife? The plot was almost identical to the one I had written for the picture. The irony was horrifying. I suggested to Dorothy that perhaps I should offer her husband $50,000 or $100,000 to start his own talent agency, since he seemed to want to run a business. DR said that was a possibility, but after hearing of the attempted theft and of how much she had already taken, all the money she had been planning to put down on a house for him, she told me she would ask her lawyers to go forward with plans for a divorce. Snyder would get half of everything she still had left, everything she made from Playboy or any other deal concluded during their marriage, but Dorothy was satisfied. She just wanted to be free, whatever the cost. In June, with another 6 weeks of shooting left, Dorothy and I started talking about a trip together as soon as the filming was completed. A 4 to 6 week vacation all over Europe. I wanted to take her to Paris and London and Rome and Venice to see everything again for the first time with Dorothy, to whom the whole world was new. Her immigration status would come up for renewal on August 1st. Officially, she was working exclusively for Playboy and required their full cooperation to be employed and to remain in the United States. One night we went over to the Colony record store on Broadway, where a young sales clerk recognized Dorothy and asked if she was indeed the Playmate of the Year. DR was looking at some tapes, a light blush and smile on her face. There was barely a pause before she answered with a definite no, as though she were politely tired of being asked the question. Afterward, she said, "Wasn't that embarrassing?" She would be relieved, she said, when her Playboy issue was off the stands. Dorothy revealed herself more and more as an expert picture actress. She understood lighting, timing, and the nuances of expression. She always made things look natural and easy, and she worked so quickly that sometimes I couldn't believe my eyes, so I would ask for a second take. The first was often perfect and the second nearly as good. She was never less than believable, with an honest simplicity that was artless. Everybody who saw the rushes, overnight prints of each day's filming, was impressed by her beauty and her skill, and her behavior on the set was letter perfect. Little rehearsal, few takes, no temperament problems, always early and prepared. At the start, there had been a minor incident with a prop man over a pair of glasses DR wanted to wear off the set. He refused to give them to her, and she complained to me, causing friction between the crewman and myself. I knew situations like that were dangerous and was trying to find a moment to explain, but she brought it up the very next evening. She was sorry, she said, for coming to me that way. I shouldn't have done that. She had arrived at a conclusion that had taken me many years to figure out. Dorothy never did this again throughout the shooting. I would come to wish that she had troubled me more with her problems. When she wasn't in a shot, Dorothy spent most of the time either watching quietly or reading a book. I could sense some of the crew's silent contempt for a blonde playmate showing off her supposed studiousness. If DR felt anything, she ignored it and went through several novels and books of short stories, poetry, and nonfiction during her 4 months in New York. She particularly liked Great Expectations, Crime and Punishment, and A Farewell to Arms. By the middle of August, she was halfway through The Idiot and said it was her favorite. Life was busy for DR. Besides the shooting, there were business meetings, phone calls, and then, when a serious illness appeared, a long series of doctor's appointments. Dorothy met with the editors of Vogue and Harper's Bazaar, and both magazines wanted fashion layouts of her to be timed with the release of the picture. There was even talk of putting her on a cover. Neither magazine had ever been willing to feature a model who had worked for Playboy, but they were going to break a precedent for Dorothy Stratton. She had overcome all the obstacles. As shooting continued, several picture and TV roles were promoted by various agents, each of whom were interested in representing her. She wanted to sign with William Morris, but to be politic, she called Hefner for his opinion. He solemnly recommended that she did not rush into anything, that he would look into matters himself upon her return to Los Angeles. It was apparent to us that Hefner wanted to keep control of Dorothy. What ultimately concerned him, we agreed, was that the William Morris agency had too much clout, that Hefner could not easily move it into deals favorable to Playboy. To appease him momentarily, Dorothy decided to wait until she returned to L.A. before signing, but she told the agents she would before the end of August. Her Playboy models deal was almost finished, and it didn't take long for word to get around that DR was making a big splash in New York. Johnny Casablanca's agency, Elite, had just signed Patty Hansen, who was the top model in the country at the time, and Casablanca's wanted Dorothy as well. The one time we met, Johnny told me how impressed he was with her. She could work all over Europe, he said, just as soon as she was free. DR told Casablanca's that her term with Playboy was nearly over and that, as soon as it was, she would sign with Elite. They shook hands on it. Because I didn't know these agents except by reputation, her choices helped avoid any accusations of my manipulating her. Patty Hansen didn't like DR very much. Already involved at the time with Keith Richard of the Rolling Stones, they would marry late in 1983, Patty nevertheless seemed to resent Dorothy on sight. I asked her once why she didn't give DR a chance. "I don't like blondes," she said. On Patty's last day of shooting, she turned to Dorothy in front of a group of the cast and crew and said, "Jesus, you got big tits." DR blushed and looked down. She didn't say anything. There was a hushed, awkward laugh, and Patty looked embarrassed. She left a few moments later. It was the last thing Patty ever said to Dorothy. Colleen Camp was also dubious at first, and distrustful, but as she came to know Dorothy, she became a close friend. They made lunch dates and went shopping on Madison Avenue or down in Greenwich Village. When filming went on late into the night, they curled up together on a single cot in an improvised dressing room. Dorothy constantly encouraged Colleen, told her how good her acting was and how much she liked her singing. She thought Colleen deserved an Oscar for her performance. For Colleen's birthday in June, Dorothy bought her a silk blouse and insisted we throw a party in Nicola's. Colleen loved the blouse. "You don't understand, DR. This is silk. Do you know what this costs?" Dorothy laughed and snapped her Kodak. They were delightful together. The most fun we had shooting was during their scenes together, along Fifth, in Soho, in the Village, on Wall Street. Dorothy with John Ritter, Colleen with Sean Ferrer, or the other way around. They were well matched, and all four shared friendship and high spirits. During my favorite sequence, with the four of them at a Fifth Avenue shoe store, Colleen sat on the sidelines with Roseanne Caton, the black actress I had last seen on the buffet line at the mansion with Dorothy. DR and I were at the far end of the store while the lights were being prepared. I was lounging on a couch and she was sitting on the floor. Roseanne looked over at us and asked Colleen if she had ever met Dorothy's husband. No, Colleen hadn't. Why? Roseanne saw him all the time around the mansion, coming on to everybody, talking big. He was a real creep, Roseanne said. She wouldn't put anything past him. Colleen turned to her. What did she mean by that? He was dangerous, Roseanne said. He was the kind of guy that might kill Dorothy and Peter and himself. Colleen was outraged. What was Roseanne talking about? Roseanne shook her head. Colleen had never met him. She couldn't understand. Colleen thought Roseanne was exaggerating, but asked DR if she thought Snyder would ever harm her. No, Dorothy said. That was not a danger. Colleen did not mention that incident to me, but Dorothy did say later, Paul doesn't think much of people. She had worried that Paul might kill himself. She thought he was capable of that, she said. He doesn't have a very high opinion of life. Outside the Roxy skating rink, we were setting up a shot that involved several of the principals. But as I looked through the camera's eye in preparation, there was a blonde double for DR. Dorothy would not be able to participate in that night's shooting. She had to be up at 6 a.m. to check into a hospital for a biopsy that would determine the nature of 2 growths that had appeared on either side of her face. Each was on the jawline just below her ear, but the one in her left had become particularly noticeable. Progressively, more care had had to be taken to hide the swelling from the camera. When she first returned to New York toward the end of May, I immediately noticed the problem. Although 7 different doctors had examined her, not one was able to make a diagnosis. The word cancer was so carefully avoided that naturally it became uppermost in our minds. Were the hard and growing tumors benign or malignant? Even if they were benign, their increasing size had to be checked, or they would become impossible to conceal on the screen. If they were malignant, an operation would have to be performed instantly, and the scars from this would show. Plastic surgery would take months, and what would happen to Dorothy's role in the picture? There would be no way to finish it. More important, what would happen to Dorothy? Disfigurement. Would it, honestly, or would it not, affect my love for her? Was love irretrievably bound to outward appearances? Or did it finally have to do with feelings and spirits, both invisible and indefinable? I never asked myself this question then, but I think I knew that my passion for Dorothy and my empathy with her was far too strong to be lessened by a change in her physical appearance. Yet these were questions we both tried to avoid, though we became increasingly anxious as one doctor after another concluded that only a biopsy could identify the disease. There were 2 biopsy choices, needle or surgical knife. Only the latter required anesthesia, and whatever the ultimate result would leave at least a half-inch scar. Her hair could conceal this, however. The needle biopsy was preferable, but it carried a risk. If the tumor turned out to be malignant, the needle might spread the disease more quickly. It could also fail to pull out enough of the growth for analysis, and the knife biopsy would then be required anyway. DR and I nevertheless agreed the needle was worth chancing, and the office operation was performed one afternoon, but it proved insufficient, so the hospital was booked. Because of the filming schedule, I was unable to accompany DR to her medical appointments, but my assistant Linda McEwen proved to be a good friend by going with her. Setting up the shots without DR, which required keeping her double the good distance from the camera, gave me a sense of what the film would be like if Dorothy could not rejoin us. There was a dark, foreboding cloud over the whole night that no amount of effort could shake. The sequence called for physical comedy and required a good mood from me to help the actors, so I tried not to allow my preoccupation to show, but I knew the work was suffering. I kept wishing I had insisted on canceling the call and letting the film's medical insurance cover the cost of the delay. Novak had argued that the picture wasn't enough hot water with Time Life. We should press on, work around Dorothy. He had little patience on the subject of DR's health and only seemed annoyed about whatever harm it might cause the movie. Sean, on the other hand, helped us find a doctor, his uncle Jose Ferrer, whom Dorothy trusted. Because of the late-night shooting, I was still asleep when the phone rang the next morning. Dorothy sounded groggy but cheerful. It was okay, she said. It wasn't malignant. I began to cry, not only because of the weight that had suddenly been lifted, but for the confirmation that, no matter how much we were risking, everything would be all right. She had a sarcoidosis, or sarcoid granuloma, an extremely rare inflammation that could be cured with small amounts of cortisone steroid if the swellings didn't subside on their own. Dr. Ferrer suggested she do nothing until her return to California in August. From the hospital, Dorothy called her mother in Vancouver and, for the first time, told Nellie of her condition. If anything had happened to her, Dorothy said, it should all be yours, Mom. She had mentioned nothing to Snyder of the problem, for fear he would use her illness as an excuse to come to New York, and she was, therefore, all the more surprised the next day when he wanted to know what she had been doing in a hospital. When she asked how he had found out, Snyder chuckled smugly and said he had his ways. Not long before DR's hospitalization, Dr. Kushner had visited New York and spent an afternoon pleading Snyder's case, that she should return to him. He seemed totally disinterested, she told me, in her point of view. When Dorothy came down a short while after Kushner left, she noticed him sitting in a car with another man. She went over and chatted briefly, and, feeling as she walked away that they were watching to see where she went, she took a circuitous route to the plaza. Even then she realized that Kushner had joined forces with Snyder against her. Later she would wonder if the doctor had fingered her for Snyder's detectives. The Wyndham experience soured her on Kushner. She had bought him the gift of a record album, but never presented it. One morning there was a knock on the door of the suite. DR went to answer, thinking it was room service. She didn't check the peephole, so the door of 1001 opened onto a pair of photographers Snyder had sent to find her. I heard Dorothy talk with them at the door. Then, from the sound, I could tell that she had moved them into the corridor, but I couldn't hear what was said. I paced irritably, wondering who the hell would crash in here like that. After a while, DR came back with proof sheets of the photos the couple had taken and explained under her breath that they had flown in from LA to see her and get permission to use one shot for a poster. They were working with Paul. I was livid. How had they known the suite number? How had they known she was here? Dorothy hadn't asked. What did I think she should do about the photos? They were waiting for a decision. She held out the proofs and I looked over her shoulder. They were nothing special, imitation Playboy bunny outfit with roller skates and garish lighting. The shots made her look cheap and ordinary, with none of her innocence or wit, and I said as much. DR turned them down diplomatically. Snyder had undoubtedly used Dorothy's money to pay for plane tickets for the photographer and his wife to come to New York and hustle her into the deal by making her feel sorry for them. Although they said the Wyndham staff had told them to try Bogdanovich's suite at the plaza, it was far more likely the information had come through detectives Snyder had retained. I didn't realize it, but this was the first conclusive evidence Snyder had that Dorothy and I were living together. Soon we would hear that Snyder was going around the mansion, telling everyone who would listen that Dorothy had run off with Bogdanovich and they were shacked up together at the plaza. I think that's awful, DR said. It's none of people's business. And yet she denied it to Paul, said she and I were good friends, that she helped out with my children, and all of that was true. While we naively thought we were being discreet and inconspicuous, the word was out around the Hollywood community. Patrick Curtis heard the rumor a number of times at the mansion. Dorothy had confirmed the truth to him, but everyone who mentioned it seemed to be quite certain as well. Mario Casilli had heard something back in May, though neither he nor Dorothy brought up the topic. Hugh Hefner, though he had heard the rumors early, probably preferred not to believe anything until it was substantiated by either of the two principals. Since neither Dorothy nor I had said a word to him on the subject, perhaps he thought it was because the affair wasn't happening. What might have worried him privately, however, was that perhaps it was, and that Dorothy had told me the truth about him and his company, that we were now united in our contempt for him. There were only 2 weeks of shooting left. July 4th fell on a Friday, giving everybody a long weekend, and no one could have appreciated it more than DR and me. There would be fireworks over the Hudson on Friday evening, and to watch them we rode across town to Riverside Drive. A lot of people were out that night, so I kept the limousine with us all the time, whether we walked along the river or into the park. Dorothy was amused at the way the car trailed along behind, and we wrote a scene like that into the movie for Colleen and Sean. We tried to get a view of the river from 72nd Street, but it was much too crowded, so we bought a couple of Eskimo pies and rode up to 90th, the street my parents had moved to when I was 13. I had lived there with them and my sister. Her arrival had prompted the move for nearly a decade, right across the street from the Soldiers and Sailors Monument. As we prowled around on that lovely hot evening while the country celebrated its freedom, we went openly together among the crowds. We held hands and didn't care who noticed. We walked across the spray-painted monument, down several paths, into the grass and over rocks, looking for the best place to see the fireworks. Dorothy was like a child who had never seen fireworks. She made me feel the same way, and we stayed there until the last starburst faded. DR and I tried not to worry about anything those last weeks in New York. I eased up on the cutting and we spent more time together on weekends, in the park or at the movies. I had been through Central Park so many times as a child, but not once in the past 20 years, except with Dorothy, and I felt like a boy again. It was as though DR had given me back the childhood I tried to forget. Even in choosing locations, I had unconsciously avoided the old neighborhoods, but Dorothy made me feel like remembering those days again, from 1 to 13, the innocent years. She was the perfect companion. It was like taking her home to my mother and father, who had died and who I know would have loved her. The early morning we finished shooting, there was a sad little wrap party at a luncheon cafe around the corner from the 10th Street apartment where we'd filmed the last few shots of the picture. The second to last was Dorothy's final close-up. She and I sat in one of the little booths at the back of the harshly lighted cafe while a lot of people came over to say goodbye. Dorothy was gracious to everyone. She was sorry to see them all go, she said. After the last person had left, Dorothy began to cry quietly. But the picture wasn't really over, I said. After we returned from our vacation, there would be more cutting, sound mixing and previews, publicity and openings. I wasn't finished with the picture, and neither was she, because I wanted her with me all the way through. As it turned out, I was wrong. The picture was over for Dorothy the night we shot her last close-up. She would be alive for only 4 more weeks. One of the last times Dorothy spoke on the phone to Snyder. He had said he wanted to meet her at LAX, but she put him off by saying that she was going over to London with several girlfriends, Colleen among them, and wasn't certain when she would return. In truth, Colleen was in London at the same time we were, but didn't want to disturb us. The wrap party was the last time she would see Dorothy. All month long, Snyder had been sending various messages, an album of all the greeting cards he had ever given to Dorothy, along with a poem. She hid these from me, and a paperback self-help manual explaining what men need. DR had looked at the book, but left it behind when she packed. What about what women need, she had said. As usual, Paul was thinking only of himself. That wasn't love. Why didn't he ever understand what she needed? Yet most of the questions that had troubled Dorothy so terribly in May seemed to have settled themselves by early July. A couple of weeks before we finished shooting, DR wrote the most contented poem of her life. It was her last. The bright green blades of grass are glistening with dew as the morning sun rises up over the hills, and a breeze ever so gently flutters them about. And she stoops to pluck a dandelion and pauses, shuts her eyes tightly, blows hard, and the white fluff dispenses all around as she makes a wish. She's thinking, but not sure of what. The day will be beautiful for a while. Instinct has been allowed to take its course and proves to be right somehow. And then she sits. Her dress encircles her, hides her feet, save the tips of her white socks and sandals. The stem of the dandelion has fallen. Somewhere it doesn't matter. No reason for coming, really. Feels much better, though. Hasn't had much time to think. She sighs and places her hand on the grass to help her stand. She looks around and sighs again, and knows it will still be there. That final weekend in New York, Dorothy brought out a medium-sized box, gift-wrapped, a present for me. The box was much heavier than it looked, and, to indicate my surprise, I pretended to stumble. Dorothy grinned, her eyes sparkling. I smiled at her manner, like a kid who can't wait for you to open a present. I felt as though I had outgrown presents. Maybe I was embarrassed, too. She had given me so many gifts. But I never expected what was inside. A unicorn made of solid brass, nearly a foot high. Did I like it? She asked, as I gingerly lifted the present out of its wrapping. The unicorn stood rearing up on its hind legs, attached to an irregularly shaped base of brass, like a tiny island on which I saw that Dorothy had had an inscription engraved. In simple block lettering it read, "To Peter, one day since yesterday, forever, Dorothy." There was a shy smile on her face. She had found something so forthright and lovely. It was no small ornament, but an extraordinary prize, and it would mean more than a dozen Oscars. We spent 10 shimmering days and 10 magical nights in London. In the distance, dark clouds were forming, warnings we tried to ignore. Dorothy's awareness of doom was far greater than mine. I would not understand until much later, long after the most tragic possibilities forecast in the signs had become horrible fact. We gave a reward to ourselves, the honeymoon we had both wanted, and it did become that in a way, a very brief and very beautiful period of borrowed time in which we tried to let the world fall away. I wanted to share with her a city I had come to know and a culture in which I sensed she would thrive, and she did. It was her first trip to Europe since she was 4. We went to the theater almost every night, from plays by Pinter to Dario Fo, caught Oscar Peterson and Ella Fitzgerald, visited Piccadilly Circus, Buckingham Palace, the National Gallery, and Trafalgar Square, and dined in restaurants all over town. Dorothy had never been to a museum, nor had she ever seen a performance of a play she had read, so we went to see Private Lives. That it was playing was a good omen, we both thought. Everything was going our way after all. But the name of the chauffeur who met us at Heathrow was a new Daimler. With a new Daimler froze our smiles. The pleasant-looking man introduced himself as Paul. DR and I avoided looking at each other. To hear the name was a reminder of everything she wanted to forget. We settled into a lovely kind of wedded life. DR was still modest with me, but less so. She allowed a dim light in the room when we made love, and when I showered, she sometimes stood at the bathroom mirror wrapped in a towel so that we could talk. Late one night, in the middle of our stay, DR was curled up on the couch in the living room, leafing through a collection of F. Scott Fitzgerald's stories she had just finished. She preferred his to Hemingway's, she had decided. The writing seemed more natural, less self-conscious. She turned to the last page of Winter Dreams and recalled for me that Dexter's friend, Devlin, is talking about the love of Dexter's life. Lots of women fade just like that. After Devlin leaves, Dexter looks out the window at the New York sunset and is overcome with a sense of loss. Dorothy began reading, without hesitation and with all the understanding in the world. The dream was gone. Something had been taken from him. In a sort of panic, he pushed the palms of his hands into his eyes and tried to bring up a picture of the waters lapping on Sherry Island and the moonlit veranda and gingham on the golf links and the dry sun and the gold color of her neck's soft down, and her mouth damp to his kisses and her eyes plaintive with melancholy and her freshness like new fine linen in the morning. Why, these things were no longer in the world. They had existed, and they existed no longer. I suddenly realized I was crying. There were usually warning signs, and I could control myself, but not this time. Dorothy continued. For the first time in years, the tears were streaming down his face, but they were for himself now. He did not care about mouth and eyes and moving hands. He wanted to care, and he could not care, for he had gone away, and he could never go back any more. The gates were closed, the sun was gone down, and there was no beauty but the gray beauty of steel that withstands all time. Even the grief he could have borne was left behind in the country of illusion, of youth, of the richness of life, where his winter dreams had flourished. DR looked over. She had read the words of the title with such soft eloquence, and saw now that I was crying. She seemed a little surprised and smiled tenderly, moved closer and put her arms around me. We spent more than 240 hours together, and the passing of each one made me yearn for another 1,000 to follow right away. When we saw Private Lives, we held each other's hands tightly during the second act. Tears came to our eyes as the performers spoke the lines I had read to Dorothy in my office nearly 8 months before. Suddenly they seemed to mean so much more. Amanda, what happens if one of us dies? Does the one that's left still laugh? Elliot, yes, yes, with all his might. Amanda, wistfully clutching his hand. That's serious enough, isn't it? Elliot, no, it isn't. Death's very laughable. Such a cunning little mystery, all done with mirrors. There was a strange moment when we left the National Theater after seeing Amadeus. We had been very moved by the production and play. The dreadful tale of how Mozart had been poisoned by the envy and hatred of the rival composer and pretended friend, Antonio Salieri. Paul Scofield's performance as Salieri captured the essential meanness and mediocrity. The terrible pettiness and suppressed venom behind a polite, courtly manner was chilling. The drama had frightening implications and disturbed us both because the play was a love story too. Mozart and Constance, his lusty wife and muse, were very much in love and had an innocence and honesty unique among the play's characters. Mozart's downfall, then, caused partially by his irreverent, often tactless habit of telling the truth, was also the destruction of an inspiring and passionate love. As Dorothy and I left the theater, our eyes met. We suddenly glimpsed the death of each other. I clutched her hand tightly and we ran to the car. Only after we were riding along the wet streets did we dare to look at one another again. One afternoon while we were shopping, Dorothy excused herself to go up the block and find some water. She was delayed, and after a while, I went searching and couldn't find her. I reacted as though she had been kidnapped. My heart was pounding by the time I finally spotted her on the crowded street. She shook her head when she saw that I was alarmed, and we embraced in the safety of the car as she said, "Poor baby." "I didn't ever want her out of my sight again," I said, and she grinned. Did she know how truly I meant what I'd said, or realized that I would have been most content if we could have been together every hour of every day for the rest of our lives? A few days later, Dorothy was lying on the bed while I sat beside her. Her mother, she said, was worried that Paul might try to harm her physically. I looked at Dorothy sharply, but she was smiling faintly. Did she agree with her mother? She shook her head no and smiled again. "I don't think Paul would ever harm me." Nellie later would tell me her own exact words. "He could cut your face," she had said. "He could ruin your face." But DR only smiled at my worried expression and repeated her belief that Paul would never hurt her. I thought then perhaps she had mentioned it because of my safety. Didn't jealous husbands often go after the lover? Somehow, for the first time, the idea seemed possible, but it didn't worry me. I was certain that Snyder could eventually be bought off. I also believed that he would never harm DR, since the thought was inconceivable to me. During one of our last days in London, Dorothy spoke about Hefner's pursuit of 2 of her friends from Playboy, both of whom were actively disinterested. DR said that, despite her reluctance, one friend had been maneuvered into sex with Hefner. When I expressed dismay, Dorothy was quick to defend her. I had no idea, she said, how difficult the pressures at Playboy were. The other friend, a future Playmate of the Year, had done everything she could to avoid Hefner, and Dorothy was saddened to have heard recently that she too had been forced through circumstances to capitulate to him. I didn't realize at the time that DR was circling around the secret she most wanted to unburden to me, watching for my reactions to her friend's misfortunes, the better to gauge my ability to deal with her own. But she was right. I had no idea. I only shook my head and said something about the women not having been as smart as she had been in avoiding the traps. Dorothy did not mention the subject again. There were other warnings I did not understand. She walked out in the middle of the first act of Dr. Faustus, Marlowe's play about the man who sold his soul to the devil in exchange for fortune, fame, and power. It was the last play she would see. Dorothy listened more and more intensely as the story unfolded. The student Faust, bored, cynical, and self-interested, reminded her all too well of the men she had just escaped. She had felt uneasy from the beginning and set forward. By the end of the fourth scene, it was clear that catastrophe was imminent. DR felt irrevocably implicated and terrified. The next scene began with a frenzied rape staged behind a scrim and accompanied by the screaming soundtrack from the shower murder in Hitchcock's Psycho. The young actress, the first woman in the play thus far, arched her torso and threw back her head in agony. As Faust and Mephisto had their way with her, the piercing, horrifying cries from the soundtrack seemed to come from the woman's silent, open mouth. The walls of the theater closed in on DR. The actress's silent scream became a shriek in Dorothy's mind, her own muffled cry of pain. As the rape went on, the flashbacks continued. Perhaps the dark, gloomy scent of the Playboy studio, the men sweating from behind their cameras as she walked around naked for them to fondle or rape in their imaginations. She had sinned as much as they, hadn't she, in the eyes of God? Wasn't that what this play was saying to her? That people still sold their souls to the devil for fame and fortune, and that others could be thrown into the bargain? DR moved slightly in her chair. I thought she was going to close her eyes or put her hands to her face, but instead she leaned over and said flatly, "I'm not going to watch this." She was past me and up the aisle and through the door before I could even figure out what she had said. I got up and left as quietly as possible. It was drizzling slightly, but DR was pacing up and down the wet sidewalk in front of the theater. She looked lovely, resolute, and a little angry. It was a relief to be out of the theater. She hated the play, she said. The idea that a man would actually sell his soul to the devil. She spoke as though she had been personally insulted. But wasn't it a metaphor? I asked. Didn't a lot of people sell themselves for money or power? But not consciously to the devil, Dorothy said seriously. That was absurd. I could stay and see the rest of the play if I wanted, but she would prefer not to speak of it any further. Back in the suite, I pressed for answers on why the show had bothered her. She began to cry, and there was a touch of hysteria in her voice that I had never heard before. "Please," she pleaded, sitting on the bed in her room, all the new clothes I had bought her packed neatly in suitcases, ready to go home. Tears rolled down her cheeks. "Please don't make me talk about it anymore. I have a right not to talk about something, don't I?" The real problem was that Dorothy understood me far better than I ever understood her until it was too late. She knew certain things would be difficult to tell me, and she wanted to protect our relationship above all, to shield me from the unpleasantness in her own life. She felt it was not my problem, that I had enough troubles with my career and family. In many ways, I didn't really understand DR until after she was killed. Some things were not clear until almost 2 years later, and I continued to find out horrors she had never told me about. I had believed that she was revealing all of her innermost secrets because I told her most of mine and would have told them all if we had had the time. There was so little time. DR and I had just begun to live, but there were fears and tears locked in her heart that I never suspected. I felt so sorry that I had pressed her, that I hadn't been quick enough to tread carefully. But Dorothy could put on a mask that was absolutely blank, that couldn't be penetrated. She had learned to deal with men, and a deadpan expression was a hint for a man to disappear. She had learned that to smile shyly only encouraged men. So many didn't know the difference between politeness and invitation. They were arrogant enough to believe that if a woman smiled or looked kind, she wanted to bed them. But why would Dorothy, I thought, feel akin to a fallen angel? On our last morning in England, 2 weeks before she was murdered, When Dorothy asked me if I had ever wanted to make a sad love story, it never entered my mind that she was thinking of us. I knew a little of the sadness she had been through, but I couldn't even guess how worried she was that our life together might be destroyed. The hell into what she had fallen was known to her in ways I never suspected, and when we fell in love, to Dorothy I became her only way out, the one hope she had to be free of the nightmare world she had been lured into while still a child. It was that same morning she asked again if I had read Our Town. During that week, we had wanted to go somewhere romantic, away from people, someplace outside in the rare London sun. The Serpentine, we were told, an area on the far side of the Thames River, where people would just like to walk, would fit the bill perfectly. As we rode toward the river, Dorothy asked the driver about the Serpentine like an excited child on an outing who wants to know everything that's going to happen. After the car pulled into a parking area down near the riverside, we took each other's hands and walked up into the paved road that ran along the shore as far as we could see. There were rowboats and children, women in hats and dresses, men in suits or sporting clothes, and lots of dogs. It was wonderfully fresh and unspoiled. Open fields of grass, large trees, and the quiet waters of the ancient river. Every moment was special during those 2 brief hours on the Thames. There was magic in the country air. From time to time, Dorothy had a faraway look that I didn't understand, and when I asked, she would say, nothing. She hadn't been thinking of anything special. Perhaps she felt as I did that we had touched the heavens, and she was afraid to speak lest the holy thing we had together be taken away from us. Perhaps there was something wrong with her. Hadn't every joy been followed by the darkest fall? Hadn't she sensed and seen danger from men since her youngest days? The stern father who deserted her, the boys who chased her, spit at her, knocked her down, kicked her, exposed themselves to her, her first lover's fury toward her, her husband's violent tirades against her, and the traumatic mansion incident. Dorothy's tentative look masked a kind of watchfulness. Yet only moments before, we had acknowledged the strength of our devotion to each other. DR had found a spot in the sun a few yards off the walkway, and she sat on the grass. I joined her as she leaned back on her arm, and we looked at each other, smiling. It seemed as though we had been transported into one of those vivid but tranquil landscapes we had seen at the National Gallery. A rare moment when 2 people were indescribably happy at the same time, in the same place, together on a cloud of perfect understanding. Dorothy started to laugh. I didn't know why, but her laughter was so infectious that I laughed too. I asked what was funny, but she was laughing so hard it took a few seconds for her to get the answer out. She shrugged her shoulders slightly and said, "Nothing." Then she laughed even louder. Now I had trouble speaking myself. Finally, I repeated the word, "Nothing?" Dorothy nodded and then shrieked with laughter, so strong and full it echoed off the skies. I had never heard anyone laugh that way, with total abandon. I joined her in body-shaking silent laughter, my sides aching. Tears streamed down our cheeks as she pointed at me and laughed even more. We were convulsed with laughter, and there wasn't any way to stop it. We would simmer down for a moment, trying to speak, and then one of us would be off again, with the other following. What we must have looked like under those trees, howling, we didn't think or care about. Dorothy's laughter that day had the joy of the ages, and I felt that it would ring through time forever. Aren't there always hunters in pursuit of the unicorn, and others who stand by and watch or weep? The most brilliant detective in the world, who might solve to the tiniest detail each possible aspect of the crime, could not give back to Dorothy 1 second more of life, nor could he give to the ones who loved her an extra moment of her radiance. Hefner, the master of the chase, set in motion the frenzy of Snyder's egomania by banning him from the mansion. 5 days after Snyder found out, Dorothy's future was gone. The killer, by committing suicide, made the most humane gesture of his life. Hefner tried to hide his own culpability, to cover up the trail of clues in public statements and at length in his own magazine. On July 30th, my 41st birthday, Dorothy and I had our longest day together, gaining back the 9 hours we had lost flying to New York and Europe. At London's Heathrow Airport, we had just begun to look through the bookstalls in the waiting area when she said, "I want to show you something," and walked over to the men's magazines. She pulled down one of Playboy's special all-photo editions, the Playboy girls of this or that, and came back, flipping quickly through the pictures. She held the magazine open for me, and I moved behind her slightly to take a better look. It was a full-page color shot of Dorothy, sitting on a rug, stark naked, legs brought up under her, smiling at someone to the right, and clearly unaware of what was visible from the left angle of Playboy's ever-vigilant cameras. Someone had perhaps made a funny remark, and while she was off guard, they caught what they wanted. The photo, and her obvious distaste for it, were heightened by the setting. Here we were, thousands of miles from L.A. or New York or Vancouver, in one of the busiest international airports, and there were the most intimate parts of her body available to all the travelers of the globe. This was hardly the photographic art of the nude that she had been promised. This was plain old pornography. "Isn't that awful?" she said, and flipped the magazine shut with contempt and returned it to the rack. It was the first time she had been that blunt on the subject. In New York, the wait at the airport was anxious and unpleasant. The Playboy immigration lawyers had done nothing to get DR's work permit extension stamped, so here at the end of July, their playmate queen was trying to re-enter the United States with a visa that expired August 1st in the year of her reign. The fellows from customs had given her a rough going over, delighting in the harassment of a beautiful woman. I saw them making a scene with Dorothy and went over to ask what the problem was. The 2 men looked up as though startled, and both gave me a look that said they were doing their all-American duty to make sure nobody gets into the United States illegally. But Snyder, his visitor's visa having expired, had managed to stay illegally in the country for some time. "It's okay, Peter," Dorothy said. I backed off, forced to watch from a distance as they instructed DR to go through each of her suitcases and made a big deal about the expiring visa in her passport. She placed a long-distance call to Playboy's immigration lawyer, but did not have enough change and charged the call to Snyder's number in L.A. Flustered and upset by the customs officials, she hadn't thought of the consequences, but now Snyder would know she was back in America. The lawyer, of course, would report her precise whereabouts to the world of Playboy. When the phone company called Snyder for approval of the charges, he knew she was flying back without letting him know. He would alert his detective, Mark Goldstein, to check all the arrivals to L.A. from New York and to stake out the Bogdanovich house. Snyder had already been in touch with a lawyer in Vancouver on an alienation of affections suit against me, and Goldstein, for at least 2 months, had been gathering information not only for that case, but for the adultery divorce action Snyder was planning as well. It was not difficult to track us down. If they missed us at the airport, they could catch us entering the gates to my place. Snyder had also borrowed a gun. That same afternoon, Hefner's people told him that Dorothy had cleared customs in New York and was headed for Los Angeles. That meant his Playmate of the Year could be videotaped attending his annual Midsummer Night's Dream Party. But DR and I had agreed in London that neither of us would go this year. Would Hefner take her absence personally? Probably he reasoned as well as Snyder did that Dorothy and I were having an affair. If he wasn't certain, it would be difficult to keep the truth from him for very long. She herself would have to tell Paul, Dorothy said, but she couldn't face telling Hefner. I agreed to do that. She was committed to Playboy for a week of various promotions in Texas, the Mojave Desert, and then, a week later, in New York. And they were talking about sending her to Chile. On the plane west, Dorothy became anxious about her phone call, but said nothing to me. Paul could behave violently. What if he came to the airport? She started visualizing scenes. An argument, a fight. The children were going to be there. Peter's friends, Blaine and Doug, might help, but they were no match for Paul if he was angry or had a gun. She felt certain that someone had been following her in New York, but then it could have been Playboy. When the last plane we would ever fly together began its long descent into Los Angeles, Dorothy took my arm and said she was scared. She began to cry. I held her hands and moved closer. She shook her head and said it again. I'm scared. I don't know why. Both of us would have preferred, if we had had any choice, to stay in Europe or to have the jet fly right on to the Orient, to anywhere but Los Angeles, the center of all of our responsibilities and problems. At the airport, where the kids met us with Novak and Dilge, Dorothy acted strangely quiet and apprehensive. She seemed to slouch into herself, and her eyes were dark. Once in the house, in her new room, there was an odd desperation in her efforts to open one of the new suitcases. The lock had jammed, and DR knelt on the floor of her room upstairs and tugged at the lock and battered the case as though her life depended on opening it. She seemed frantic. I tried to calm her down and took over for a few moments before she insisted on resuming the struggle herself. Finally, the lock sprung loose. We were relieved. The suitcase had suddenly become a bad omen we had to vanquish. That first evening, she stood at the upstairs doorway, crying again. She was sorry, she said. It was just difficult. We had been alone together, and now there were so many people. I took her in my arms and tried to console her. It would be easier soon. We just had to make it through August, I said, quoting a previous conversation, and DR smiled slightly. When Hefner was told Dorothy was arriving from London, he instructed his people to make certain Paul Snyder was not to come to the Midsummer Night's Dream Party unless he came with Dorothy. The call went out. They were terribly sorry, but understood there were problems in the marriage, and since Dorothy was Playmate of the Year, it was important for her to feel free to attend this important event. That night, under a large waning moon, Snyder parked his Mercedes across Sunset from Bel Air and walked quickly the 2 or 3 short blocks to the gates of my house. The loaded 38 pressed into him. He found a place in the bushes from where he could see both the entrance and the exit. Hiding there, he waited for Dorothy or me to come out. He would show us how he dealt with betrayal. No one went in or came out for several hours. Finally, Snyder walked back to his car, drove up to Mulholland Drive, and thought about killing himself, he later told a girlfriend. He held the borrowed revolver up to the sky and fired twice. Then he returned to the house on Clarkson. In most Hollywood circles of the late 70s and early 80s, someone who didn't take cocaine regularly was the exception rather than the rule. Snyder had been using it more and more. Dorothy didn't know how much or what effect it was having on him. Cocaine gives an icy cold high that freezes your head and makes you believe you are all-powerful, invincible, and righteously correct in all of your appetites and impulses. It is the most self-deceiving of drugs and the most insidious, quietly turning every frequent user into a Mr. Hyde. If grass is the drug of peace, cocaine is the drug of war. By late evening, Dorothy had calmed down considerably. Her new lawyer, Wayne Alexander, had left a message assuring her that he had checked on the immigration business personally and that everything would be all right. The permit would be renewed for another 6 months. That gave them plenty of time to work on a permanent visa. Once she was divorced and could marry me, these problems would disappear. At my house, we were being pulled in several directions at once. The kids and the production people all wanted time with me. Linda and a new woman accountant, who were working in the pool house offices, needed questions answered. Playboy was pressing about whether I was going to be at the dream party, but I put off an answer. When Dorothy and I were finally alone for the night, she took my hand and led me into the octagonically shaped room she had adopted. It had French windows at one end and French doors at the other, opening out onto a small balcony overlooking the front yard. There were 6 built-in closets around the walls, 3 with full-length mirrors, a wicker desk, a table and 2 chairs, and a white wall-to-wall carpet with a large Persian rug over it. Dorothy had unpacked, and she took great delight in showing me where she had put everything, as she had at the Wyndham. That night, she wore one of the nightgowns we had bought in London, brushed white cotton. She moved swiftly across the room, got into bed, leaned over and kissed me for a long time. She pressed hard against my lips. Hers were so full they could cover mine. After what seemed like hours, DR leaned on her arm and, a slight twinkle in her eye, looked at me with an aura of mock masculinity. She leaned in close and kissed me again. A Mozart concerto played in the background. She undid the buttons of my pajama top while her lips kissed mine. Then she leaned back and, with one flick of her wrist, flung open the top. I smiled faintly. She flicked the other side of the shirt off my chest, rubbed her hand in its hair, and looked at me. Then she stuck out her jaw and clenched her teeth slightly, which meant that I was about to be in a lot of trouble. We laughed, she fell on top of me, and we kissed for a long time. She continued her seduction, having decided to take the lead tonight. No woman ever had a more willing victim. When DR made love to me that way, though it was a parody of the usual male role, her manner was light, and she was extraordinarily sexy. She had stopped being so troubled about the difference in the size of her breasts because I had told her honestly that they suited the 2 sides of her face. The right side, which matched the larger breast, was slightly older, more sensual, wittier. The more delicate, virginal left breast was appropriate to the softer, more innocent side. 15 days later, Paul Snyder would blast away that side of Dorothy's face and finally destroy what he had never been able to possess. Dorothy was born under the sign of Pisces, the fish, and this was never more evident than when I saw her for the first time in my pool, swimming around with the playful, natural ease of a dolphin, combined with the magical beauty of a mermaid come to life. The water was clearly her domain. At one point she began to laugh, that wonderful laugh of exhilaration I had heard barely a week before on the grass of the Serpentine. Just as had happened then, her laughter in the pool came without warning or provocation. The girls were amazed and reacted the way I had. They started laughing too. "What was she laughing at?" Tony asked, and I said, "Nothing." DR nodded and laughed even more, splashing down to the side as she did. Antonia and Sashi and I howled together. I had never seen them laugh with greater abandon or with fewer defenses. It was the finest laughter of children, a celebration of being alive. Could they hear us out on the side street nearby? Could Goldstein hear us laughing? Did he tell Snyder? The next afternoon, Dorothy and I saw one of the first Galaxina ads in the trade papers. Her billing read, "Introducing Dorothy R. Stratton, Playboy Playmate of the Year as Galaxina." I asked DR if she had known they would run the Playboy logo along with her name, but she just looked at the page intently. There was another plug for Playboy in the ad copy. After several minutes, Dorothy said in a low voice, "The bastards." Then she shook her head and repeated the words more quietly. That same evening, Goldstein wandered the grounds of the mansion during the grand 1980 Midsummer Night's Dream party. Goldstein had met Hefner. He had been to the mansion before, and nobody went to Hefner's unless the boss had personally approved the name. The security was tight as a drum. Hefner didn't like surprises. Snyder's latest find, 17-year-old Patty Lorman, moved into the Clarkson house that evening. She brought her waterbed, her saddle shoes, records, and her cheerleader outfit. Snyder would have liked to see her in those high school clothes. Later, Patty told me that Paul would insinuate more intimacy with her in public than she would have liked, but otherwise she thought he treated her pretty well. Meanwhile, Goldstein was getting evidence for him at the mansion. When Snyder heard from Goldstein that neither Dorothy nor I had shown up that night, he must have thought, at least we weren't at the mansion making a fool out of him. We spent the night at home together. We had only 7 more nights to sleep in each other's arms. The next morning, Saturday, August 2nd, Dorothy and the kids and I had breakfast in the kitchen. DR suggested we send away to the Kellogg Company for the cup and dish advertised on the back of the Raisin Bran box. She cut out the coupon, filled it in, enclosed the cash, and put the envelope in the mailbox outside. The plastic prizes didn't arrive until nearly 2 months after she was killed. Painted on each was a sun with 10 star-like rays. After breakfast, she went to Patrick Curtis's house to pick up her things. She still had the key Curtis had given her 2 years before, just after the jacuzzi incident at the mansion. Their final hour together wasn't anything remarkable, Patrick would remember later, just 2 friends talking. They sat around the kitchen, as in the old days. Patrick was her only real friend in Los Angeles. She could tell him the truth. In April, Dorothy called Curtis from New York and told him what had happened between us. And later, in May, they had lunch together at a restaurant in Beverly Hills, and she told Patrick that it was over with Paul, but that she was trying to end it as kindly as possible. After that, she called him again from Manhattan to say how well the picture was going and what a great time she was having. Patrick remembered the first day he had met her, 2 years before. How he had hoped she might fall in love with him. Yet she had done the next best thing. She had come to trust him as a friend. He remembered the way she had taken him into the kitchen once while she was living at his home, and told him he did not have to tell all his friends that there was nothing going on between the 2 of them. It was nobody's business. If some people wanted to believe they were having an affair, let them. They would probably think it no matter what either of them said. Curtis carried the box out to the trunk of her car. Must be books, he thought, because it was quite heavy. He kissed her. Dorothy thanked him again for everything and waved as she drove off. Patrick waved and walked back inside. He grinned, thinking of Hefner's reaction to the news of our affair. Hefner had blown his chances that first time. He had never understood Dorothy. She hadn't gone to the dream party last night, yet she had time to drop in on Patrick. Snyder must have known from Goldstein of Dorothy's visit to Curtis. Maybe for these past 2 years she had been playing him for a patsy, when all the time Snyder thought he had been manipulating her. She was smart, Snyder knew, smarter than he was, but he was cunning, and he could fool her easily by playing to her sympathies. And she was frightened of yelling, of any kind of violence. If he could just get to her, he could always break her down. Later that afternoon, DR asked me if I thought she should call her husband right away. I said it was up to her. She said she was dreading the call and preferred to wait a little longer. My daughters prevailed on DR and me to drive them down to an ice cream parlor for cones. As we arrived, Antonia noticed that the side street opposite the entrance was called Dorothy Street. Dorothy's joyful shriek was mixed with relief at spotting a lucky omen. Her reaction was so spontaneous that the kids and I roared with laughter, and then Dorothy did too. Was Goldstein watching us as we piled out of the car, still laughing? And as Dorothy ran over to look at the street sign? The kids dashed after her, and the three of them gazed at the sign and laughed. They walked back toward me, one on either side of Dorothy, holding her hands. Did Goldstein tell Snyder how happy the four of us looked as we crossed the street and went into the shop? How evil did we seem in his eyes, and how sinful would it appear in photographs? Stratton and Bogdanovich and his two daughters having ice cream cones on a bright sunny afternoon. That evening, DR and the girls and I were in the kitchen when a large dog suddenly trotted in. His reddish tan coat was long, and he looked like a cross between a collie and a German shepherd. As he came through the door, the children saw him first. They cried out in surprise and tried to catch the dog by his collar. Wagging his tail excitedly and with a definite sense of purpose, the dog moved directly toward Dorothy. She spoke to him as though they were old friends. "Hello there, boy." He came right up to her and put his front paws onto her chest. She grabbed the paws, lifted them to her shoulders, and moved her face up to him. As the dog licked her nose, Dorothy laughed, and so did the girls. I hadn't moved. "Was he safe?" I asked. Dorothy said, "Oh, sure, he's a good boy," and squeezed his nose. Then she patted back his ears. It was almost as though the dog wanted to tell her something. His paws on her shoulders, mouth open, panting, making sounds between a cry and a bark. "What is it, BB?" DR said, and the children laughed merrily. The dog became more excited than ever and barked twice. Dorothy petted him and put his paws down to check the name tag on the collar. His name was Prince, and there was a phone number. "He loves Dorothy," Sashi said. Why had he run away? Antonia wondered, and Sashi said, "Because he wanted to see Dorothy." The owners of the dog were called, and we were all sorry when they answered. The girls petted Prince and talked to him. He was pleasant to them, but he had eyes only for Dorothy. Wherever she went, he followed. The gate bell rang. The dog's owners arrived. Antonia buzzed the gates open, and the three women took Prince out to the driveway while I waited in the kitchen. They all returned looking unhappy. The owners had been awful. There were 3 people in the car, and they had pulled Prince in roughly. As the car drove off, the dog was being beaten. DR went over to the sink, and the girls followed. "No wonder he ran away," Antonia said. "People could be so awful," said Dorothy. Just before midnight, DR and I finished getting the kids to sleep, went upstairs and got under the covers. Before we noticed the time again, it was 3 in the morning. A limousine was arriving at 11:30 to take her to the airport for her trip to Houston. She curled into my arms in the dark, her head on my shoulder, and I hugged her warm body close to mine, trying not to think about her going. Maybe a miracle would happen and she wouldn't have to leave. The next 4 days were a blur of phone calls and business meetings. The cutting had yet to be completed on, they all laughed. On Monday morning, August 4th, Dorothy drove over to her new apartment on Spalding in Beverly Hills, where she was sharing the rent, though not the space, with Linda McEwen. She needed a separate mailing address, and we both knew that having a place where one can be alone was important. The limousine took her to LAX, where a non-stop flight brought her to the Houston airport. She was greeted with open arms by Elizabeth Norris, and then scooted off to a series of interviews, photo sessions, and personal appearances, all the while extolling the glories of the Playboy world. Goldstein probably also informed Snyder of Dorothy's trip to the airport. That same morning, Wayne Alexander had called my house to get a final answer on the Snyder-sponsored roller skate poster. Dorothy had left word, with my encouragement, to pass on the deal. Later, of course, I would desperately wish that I had told her to let Snyder have his damned poster. Perhaps the gesture would have somewhat abated his mounting fury. Alexander called Mike Kelly and said Dorothy did not want to go forward. He would be sending a letter to that effect along with the poster, but wanted Kelly to know immediately where they stood. Kelly called Snyder, who phoned Alexander, sounding angry and sullen. Where was his wife? Alexander said he could not give out that information. He never spoke with Snyder again. Later in the day, the phone rang, and when Snyder answered, it was Dorothy calling him long distance. She was in Houston, she said, and she hoped he was all right. Snyder was so surprised by the call, he wasn't sure how to play it. He asked when she would be back, when he could see her. DR told the truth. She wouldn't be back until late Thursday or Friday morning. Why didn't they have lunch together on Friday, August 8th? She would come by around 2. Snyder said he loved her, and Dorothy said she loved him, but that he had to understand she had not changed her mind about wanting her freedom. Snyder must have hung up the phone feeling elated. She was coming back after all. Earlier that afternoon, I had placed a call to Hugh Hefner. When he was told I was calling, Hefner barely hesitated before he told his secretary to say that he was in a meeting. It was 5 days since we had returned from London, and Dorothy was off in Houston. Hefner did not return the call. Also, Hefner was hearing reports about Dorothy in Texas. She had changed her hair to a simpler style and was wearing almost no makeup. Once the Playboy models had lost their innocence, their image changed. The Sunday school girl next door became the Vegas showgirl in the next motel. It was part of a standard male fantasy. The innocent Madonna turned into the wanton harlot. These were the only 2 sides of a woman worth mentioning. Of course, sex was more fun with the prostitute because she knew what to do. But the special thrill was in the memory of her innocence. That defiled virginity could sustain many an erection. DR was not behaving in the approved Playboy tradition. After all, she was Playmate of the Year. On Wednesday, August 6th, DR and Elizabeth flew to Dallas. Dorothy had talked as much as possible about They All Laughed, without a hint of our involvement, and she gave the usual party line about Playboy whenever necessary. There was nothing wrong with posing nude, and Hefner really did love and respect women. He was nothing like his reputation, it amused her to say, because it wasn't a lie. Elizabeth told Dorothy she ought to talk more about Playboy and put on more makeup. Dorothy didn't want to look like an albino, did she? That night, Dorothy called me from Dallas in tears. At a banquet for Playboy distributors who had flown in from all over the country, one of them had come up and grabbed her right breast in his hand and turned to one of his pals to take a photograph. I had never heard her so upset. She felt humiliated and dirtied, raped. She couldn't wait to come home. She had arranged to take the evening flight Thursday rather than stay overnight again in Dallas. After I had phoned Hefner for 3 days in a row, with no success, on August 7th he finally returned my calls, apologizing for the delay. I asked if I could drop by for a chat the following week. "Any time," Hefner said coolly. I felt the iciness in his tone and tried to warm things up by telling him how well the movie had gone and how good Dorothy was in it. The part had been greatly enlarged, I said, and I felt confident that it would have a tremendous impact on her career. Hefner said he had heard some rumors that Dorothy and I were... Yes, I said, it was true. We were in love. There was a brief pause, followed by a sort of hollow chuckle, and then Hefner said, "Well, you always did have a weakness for blondes." I laughed much too loudly and felt more and more uneasy. I had been hoping to put off the facts until I could see Hefner next week, but clearly he did not care to wait. I said that no matter what he might have heard, it was serious between Dorothy and me, that we loved each other, that she was the first woman who had ever really made me want to settle down. He said he was glad to hear it. I said I did not want anyone but him and some other close friends to know the truth because it could only hurt Dorothy and me in our relationship. That's going to be a pretty difficult thing to keep quiet, Hefner said. Not necessarily, I said, if none of us confirmed it for a while. But Hefner told me he had already heard rumors. Then he said, Look, if you're worried about that husband, I'll just make sure he's not allowed in here without Dorothy. He had taken care of that last week for the dream party, Hefner said, but we hadn't come by. He was going to make certain that creep never got in there again, and then Dorothy and I could feel free to drop by any time of the day or night. I tried to make him understand that her husband was by no means the only issue. Hefner repeated that keeping it a secret was going to be impossible. Soon after he put down the phone, Hefner told one of his assistants to make certain that Paul Snyder did not get into the mansion any more unless he was accompanied by Dorothy Stratton. Less than 2 hours later, at 4:48 p.m., the Delta flight from Dallas touched down at LAX, and the limousine brought Dorothy to the apartment on Spalding, where she got into her own car and quickly drove the few minutes to Copa de Oro. She was in my arms by 6:30. Snyder had told Goldstein of their impending rendezvous the next day for lunch, sounding optimistic about a reconciliation. As usual on Thursday evenings, Goldstein bought The Recycler, a weekly paper that featured personal ads of all sorts, including the sale of weapons, handguns, rifles, shotguns. He perused the pages casually that night and kept it with his papers in the car. Wasn't Snyder always talking about getting another gun? Maybe he ought to, for protection. While unpacking her bags, DR casually showed me a Playboy test slide of herself made up to look like Bridget Bardot. It was part of Hefner's Marathon Screen Goddess pictorial for Playboy's cable, videocassette, and stag movie plans. The whole thing was a modern version of the old Hollywood whorehouses that used to feature lookalikes for the most popular current screen actresses. For a price, you could fuck your favorite movie star. The best of both worlds for the Playboy readers and the magazine, which had made everybody's girl next door into a hooker and was now preparing to do the same with the great women of the screen. I held the slide up to the light. It was a headshot of DR in a red wig with several thick and shiny coats of pancake on her face, heavy on the lipstick, rouge, mascara, and eyeshadow. The photo looked about as appetizing as one of the figures in the Hollywood Wax Museum. From the center, Dorothy's eyes looked out sadly, like those of someone trapped in a cave. The picture depressed me, but I didn't want to make her feel worse. She had to do the job. I told Dorothy I had spoken with Hefner, but didn't mention the threatened barring of Snyder, feeling vaguely guilty. She was having lunch with Paul tomorrow, which was going to be difficult enough. I didn't want to worry her about Hefner's manner on the phone. During dinner that night, I suggested that Blaine and Doug follow Dorothy over to Snyder's the next day. He would recognize me. They agreed, and Novak said they could follow at a discreet distance, go into the restaurant, and sit several tables away to keep an eye on things. But DR said no, she really didn't need anyone to follow her over, and she thanked the fellows for offering. Blaine asked if she was sure of that, and Dorothy nodded. Yes, it was all right. There was nothing to worry about. She had spoken with Paul, and he had sounded fine. She would make sure they went to a restaurant. Playboy was talking about sending DR to New York to do the Merv Griffin show. The Croft brothers wanted her to co-star in a Western with Bruce Stern, eventually released as Harry Tracy. They were offering $100,000, and the script wasn't bad. If anything could bring Westerns back, I thought, Dorothy could. She had the wit and elegance of a 19th century aristocrat, as well as the innocence of a country girl in chaps, wrestling the cattle as well as any man. One way or the other, it looked as if Dorothy was going to do a lot of traveling, and she and I would often be separated. We fell asleep in each other's arms early on the morning of Friday, August 8th. That day was the first time Dorothy and Paul saw each other since the beginning of May. She had written the legal statement of separation in June. Now, a month and a half later, Dorothy was driving over to the house on Clarkson. She was not looking forward to the meeting, and the closer she got, the more she wanted to turn around and run. But it had to be gotten over with, she thought. There was nothing else to do. Snyder, dressed in a suit, welcomed her warmly. There were roses and champagne set out, but she didn't even take a sip. Nor did she pay much attention to the flowers or the note he had written. She wanted to go to a restaurant. They did, and then came back and had a loud argument. It was the first time Dorothy admitted to Snyder her love for me. Snyder had done a lot of checking and collected a considerable storehouse about me to tell Dorothy, strewn across a leader of 15 years in the public and private wars of Hollywood. I had destroyed Sybil Shepherd's career. Was that how Dorothy wanted to end up? Bogdanovich had paid a girl $5,000 to sleep with himself and another man. What did she have to say about that? It had happened at the mansion, he said, and a lot of people knew about the incident. Dorothy didn't believe it and said she didn't want to hear about it. In the jacuzzi, Snyder went on, Bogdanovich had paid this girl, Lee, $5,000 to fuck him and his friend Bob. That was the kind of guy she was in love with, he said. But maybe she hadn't minded that night with Hefner in the jacuzzi. Maybe that was the kind of stuff she really liked. Dorothy got angry. She had only done the Playboy stuff for Snyder in the first place. Hadn't he told her that she might have to sleep with Hefner? He hadn't even cared. He had been using her from the beginning. Snyder began to scream at her, and Kushner's dog began to bark. Soon after, Dr. Kushner had come in on them, and they quieted down. He had stopped by to get his German shepherd, who was locked up outside, barking and crying because of the shouting. The neighbors could hear nothing beyond the constant roar of the freeway. After the doctor went upstairs, there was no further shouting. The interruption turned Snyder around. He realized his ace had been played, and she hadn't batted an eyelash. Brainwashed, she definitely had been brainwashed. He realized that he had lost Dorothy, and he began to cry. He sang her a song and became more depressed. Did she really mean it when she told him she wanted to be friends, even though she was in love with someone else? Dorothy seemed to be sincere as she spoke, and he cried even harder. What a fool he had been. Eventually, Dorothy was able to cheer him up, and by the time Patty Lorman arrived, the two of them seemed quite friendly. Was she staying? Patty asked, since both of them were smiling when she walked in. No, damn it, Paul said lightly. She's got to leave. Dorothy looked over a closet full of her remaining clothes, took one or two items, and told Patty she could have everything else. Dorothy and Paul seemed to have reached an understanding. Patty left them alone again. The phone rang. It was Linda McEwen, Snyder said, and he tried not to sound too hostile. DR took the call and said she would be leaving soon for their meeting at the apartment. It was the story Linda and I had cooked up as an excuse for her to call. I had been worried and asked Linda to see if everything was okay. Of course, Dorothy couldn't talk, Linda would tell me, but her voice sounded all right. She would be coming back shortly. Dorothy left Clarkson soon after the call. Everything would be okay, she told Paul. She would call him on Sunday just to see how he was. Dorothy felt sorry for Paul, she told me. He had cried, and at one point he tried to kiss her and take her in his arms. His touch had made her skin crawl. His eyes looked so sad, Dorothy said, making no mention of the seedy accusations. 2 years later, John Riley would tell me that during the summer of 1980, Snyder had learned his version of the Lee-Bob story from Lee's former husband, and that the two men had cursed me and agreed that I deserved to be punished severely, maybe even shot. Certainly Snyder would have used the story on DR as an example of my true nature. But Dorothy said only that Snyder had delivered a diatribe against me, quoting the usual inaccurate Sybil Shepherd stories. If she had brought up the Lee Bob incident, I would have told her its true origin. How Bob had lured me into a compromising position with Lee at the mansion's jacuzzi. 6 months afterward, I had tried to help Lee, who had had a haunted childhood compounded by humiliating experiences in the men's magazine business. She stayed at my house a few days. I had then given her a cashmere sweater and $5,000 to rent an apartment and have her car fixed. Though DR said nothing of this story, it must have given her pause. Could she trust me fully? Late that afternoon, Dorothy and my sister Anna met for the first and only time. Anna had come over to bring me a belated birthday present, a bow and arrow. The gift puzzled me, but she gave me no reason for selecting it, and so I was not alarmed. That same evening, while DR and the kids and I made dinner in the kitchen, Prince the dog suddenly returned. We couldn't figure out how he had gotten in, since the front door was closed. He again went immediately over to Dorothy, barking and yelping, and seemed even more insistent than ever on telling her something. We thought perhaps he was simply overjoyed to see her, but Prince acted as though he had run away only to be with Dorothy. His paws were on her shoulders, and he was licking her face, his tail wagging furiously. Saturday didn't go well for Snyder. He phoned the mansion to get his name and Patty's cleared for the next night, and was told he was barred. He was livid. It was the worst day of his life. He had lost his wife and his second father. Well, he would show them. He would show all of them. They would be very sorry for excluding him from their happy threesome, the Star Makers and their star. The world had not heard the last of Paul Leslie Snyder. Soon after, his actor friend Chip came by and took back the gun he had lent Snyder. He was leaving town and needed to have it with him. Coming from the house, with the giant curve of the freeway behind, Snyder pointed the .38 up toward the sky and fired. Goldstein was there and noticed how the sound was washed out by the noise of the freeway, but Kushner's dog started to bark. Chip saw that his gun had been fired before, but didn't mention it. They all shook hands, and Chip drove off feeling relieved. He had never felt quite right at the idea of Paul having his gun. Snyder then put the heat on Goldstein to help him get a weapon for protection. Goldstein later would recount. Snyder said that maybe Hefner or Bogdanovich was going to try to have him deported or killed. They were shutting him out of everything. Maybe they would try to finish him off for good. Goldstein played along and took Snyder to a gun shop. Snyder wanted a small machine gun, and the shop had just what he wanted. Goldstein refused to buy it in his name. Snyder had the money to pay, but was not a U.S. citizen, and his visa had expired. He could probably pick up something through the personal ads in the recycler Goldstein had bought. Owner sales required no registrations or paperwork. Before long, Snyder had found the item that appealed to him. It was an 8-shot shotgun. He called the owner, a man named Tuck, who agreed to come over and show him the weapon the next morning. In the meantime, Snyder didn't need the Playboy mansion. He would have his own goddamn parties. He got Lynn, his main girlfriend at the time, and Patty together and invited everybody they could think of to a barbecue. He didn't want anyone to think he was depressed, and he would tell Dorothy what he was going to do when she called tomorrow. He would scare the bitch to death. Dorothy's sister, Louise, had arrived from Vancouver that morning at 10, and Dorothy met her at the airport gate. Had Goldstein been watching? On the way home from the airport, Dorothy told Louise that they wouldn't be staying at Paul's anymore. Dorothy was getting an apartment with Linda, Peter's secretary, she said, but it wasn't quite ready yet, so they would be staying at Peter's house in the meantime. She had not yet told Louise that we were lovers. Louise was a sweet, shy girl with a wild sense of humor when her introspective nature let it out. She had a critical, watchful eye and looked out for her big sister's welfare. When they got to the house, and after everyone had been introduced, the two sisters called to tell their mother that Louise had arrived safely. DR had warned her not to say where they were staying, not to mention Peter's place at all, or to give out any numbers. She didn't want to worry their mother. Nellie was happy speaking to her daughters together, and she was especially relieved to hear Dorothy's voice. She had been terribly worried about her. Had Dorothy received her letter? Nellie had sent a letter to New York early in July. No, Dorothy said. It must have missed her, but the hotel would forward it. She had left her business manager's address. Nellie asked about Paul, and Dorothy said everything was all right. She had seen him yesterday, and they had agreed to be friends. But he was very sad, Mom, Dorothy said. He cried. Nellie told her not to see Paul again. She knew what men were like. Dorothy should try to get out of the city for 6 to 8 months to let things cool down. Playboy wanted to send her to Chile, Dorothy said, but there was unrest there. Nellie told her to go anyway. It would be safer than being anywhere near Paul. She would get her new husband to call immigration again about that rat Snyder, get him out of the United States and away from Dorothy. When Louise was finished, Dorothy grabbed the phone to say goodbye again. It would be the last time that Nellie would hear the voice of her first child. Goodbye again, Mom, she had said. Don't worry. See you soon. Later, Louise asked which house was better, this one or Hefner's. This one, DR said. This one is much better. At 9 a.m. on Sunday, August 10th, Mr. Tuck, the owner of the shotgun that would be used to kill Dorothy Stratton, arrived at the Clarkson house to show the weapon to Paul Snyder. Dr. Kushner answered the door and checked, but Snyder was out. Tuck was annoyed. He had driven all the way from the San Fernando Valley because Snyder had said he would be there in the morning. It was about a shotgun he had for sale. Less than half of the people who had been invited to the barbecue at Clarkson that afternoon showed up. To maintain his bravado, Snyder had cocaine in the bathroom. Dorothy had said she would call him, but as the hours went by and she didn't call, he believed her less, taking more coke to keep his cool. Every hour increased the rage inside him. Every minute clicked off another imagined lie, one more moment of deceit. They were all against him. At one point he told a friend, maybe this deal has just got too big. Maybe I just ought to go back to Vancouver for a while. No, he mustn't give up. He must fight for his rights. There had been barely a moment's peace for Dorothy from the time she had awakened. When the Playboy limousine arrived at Spalding, the driver loaded the sisters' bags in the trunk. They piled into the back and started off on the 3-hour drive to the Mojave Desert. Paul Snyder had ended the night in a fury because Dorothy had not called him as promised. But he would show her. He would have his gun tomorrow. At the mansion, the staff had been making jokes about the fact that the Playmate of the Year hadn't been there in nearly 3 months. Otherwise, it had been just the end of another typical weekend for Hefner, nothing very unusual, but it would be Dorothy Stratton's last weekend alive. Her final Monday, August 11th, began very early in the desert. They were shooting by 6. The heat meant they'd have to quit by 11. The shoot would then continue until the sunlight was gone. The result would be a print advertisement for an eyeglass frame company owned by Playboy. No naked pictures were involved. The money was the usual $500 a day, no matter how many hours. For a normal 8-hour day, a top model of the time, such as Patty or Sean Casey, would have made close to 4 times that amount, and neither of them was starring in 2 forthcoming features, nor had the media attention Dorothy had generated in less than a year. But Playboy models kept it all in the family. Why pay Dorothy more just because she had earned it? The first thing Paul Snyder did that morning was to call Mr. Tuck about the shotgun. He would drive out to the valley in the late afternoon, and they could exchange cash for weapon. Tuck filled out a purchase order dating it 8/11/80. When they broke from shooting, Dorothy and Louise went swimming in the small pool at the motel, and the Playboy crew joined them. Everyone must have noticed how happy Dorothy seemed, despite lack of sleep and 5 hours of hard work in the sweltering heat. She and her kid sister were like two seals. 3 times in less than a month, Dorothy had been deliriously happy. Louise could never remember seeing Dorothy laugh the way she did that day. She had reason to laugh. Peter loved her, Hefner wasn't going to hold it against her, and Paul understood. In a year, she would be free of Playboy forever, and maybe Paul and Patty would get married and they would be happy. Life and love were possible, after all. Dorothy could have children and be happy with the father. She had always wanted a big family, and already there were 2 prospective stepchildren she loved. The money she would make in movies would give her mother freedom, too, a freedom Nellie had never known. She was sure that Nellie and Peter would get along, and Peter and John. Finally, they could both have their families in order. But what would become of this happiness? Would the love and fulfillment of New York, London, Bel Air, and now Mojave bring something equally terrible? If her joy was this great, would the punishment be as well? Dorothy excused herself to place a long-distance call to Clarkson Street in Los Angeles. She had promised to phone yesterday. When Snyder answered, the first thing Dorothy said was how sorry she was not to have called. She had had to go to Mojave for Playboy, but Snyder cut her off with a storm of abuse on a level so fierce it made her tremble. It is safe to assume, based on what I now know about Snyder's previous behavior, that he used the harshest words he could conceive of to frighten Dorothy into coming back to see him again. Why would she have been so upset unless he had called her every name imaginable and told of the detectives, of the night he had waited with the .38, of the gun he had ordered to blow her brains out, and Hefner's, and Bogdanovich's, and his 2 children's, and her sister's, and then he was going to blow out his own brains. She was a lying, scheming, conniving cunt, and he was going to blow everybody off the face of the earth. Dorothy began to cry. She begged him to calm down and explain what had made him so angry. Surely it could not be only because she had been 12 hours late in calling. And Snyder started to scream again, so viciously she had to hold the phone away from her ear. She could stop playing dumb. He knew what she was doing. He was on to her. She was a lying, scheming bitch. Out by the pool, Louise was becoming concerned. Why had Dorothy gone away so suddenly and been away so long? Maybe she was sick in the bathroom. Louise walked to their room. As she raised her hand to the doorknob, she could hear Dorothy's voice. It sounded as though she were crying. Her tone was pleading. Louise moved close to the door. The sun was hot and the asphalt burned her bare feet. Now she could understand the words quite clearly. "Please, please, Paul," Dorothy cried. "Don't be like that. Don't do this to me." Louise felt both afraid for Dorothy and guilty for eavesdropping, though she hadn't really been able to help it. Anybody walking by would have heard through the thin walls, and several among the Playboy crew did. She put her hand on the knob but didn't turn it. Dorothy's voice rose again, half sobbing, half angry. "I will come to see you, but please, please don't say those things." Louise tried to turn the knob, but it was locked, which somehow frightened her more. She called out Dorothy's name and knocked on the door. There was quiet for a moment, and then she heard, "Just a second," and when the door opened, she could tell Dorothy had been crying. Her eyes were bloodshot. Louise felt tears come to her own eyes, and she asked what the matter was, but Dorothy said it was nothing. She returned to the floor between the 2 beds, where she had been sitting with the phone. She told Snyder her sister was waiting and she would have to go now, but Louise could hear the angry sound of Paul's voice, though the words were not clear and she tried not to listen. Dorothy attempted to cut the conversation short. She would be back in a few days, and she would definitely come to see him, she promised, but only if he did not talk that way any more. She would call him soon from L.A. Louise had been with her sister through marital arguments before, and Dorothy always had been able to put away the miseries afterward, but this time was different. DR threw some water on her face, put on her new sunglasses again, and took Louise back to the pool. Everyone noticed how different her mood was. A couple of guests had overheard some of the conversation, and Dorothy volunteered to several of the crew that she had had a difficult phone call. She would tell me over the phone that night that she had had a very unpleasant conversation with Paul. The obviously potent effect Snyder's anger had on Dorothy only encouraged him further. Now she was begging him, wait till she saw his gun. With Patty, he drove out to Richard Brander's acting studio in the Valley, ranting about Hefner and Bogdanovich and Dorothy, his duplicitous wife, but he would show them. The drugs he took only increased the fever pitch. On the way out to Tux, however, Snyder got lost, which made him angrier and more lost. Eventually he gave up and furiously drove back to Clarkson. Why should he have to drive around anyway? Let the shotgun be brought to him. He wouldn't be needing it until later in the week, maybe not until Thursday. Let Tuck meet him someplace tomorrow or the day after. That would be soon enough. Snyder and Tuck made an appointment at a construction site for Wednesday afternoon, August 13th. On Monday afternoon, I left another message at the mansion. Would it be okay if I dropped by to see Hefner on Tuesday afternoon? Louise had a bad dream that night, and then woke up to find she hadn't been dreaming. Dorothy was in the next bed, crying quietly into her pillow. Sad and frightened at once, Louise said, "Dorothy?" The crying stopped immediately, and there was silence. Louise said her sister's name again, but received no response. Eventually, Louise decided it must have been a dream after all, and soon fell asleep again. By the time I got up on Tuesday, August 12th, DR and Louise were already off in the desert shooting. I was anxiously looking forward to seeing Dorothy and had a surprise for her. We were preparing another movie to shoot very soon, and she had the leading female role. That afternoon, driving out of the parking lot of the Cafe Rodeo in Beverly Hills, Patrick Curtis stopped at the curb and pointed out to his passengers the young man on roller skates coming toward them. It was Paul Snyder, and quite obviously he was zonked out on something. Coke, Quaaludes, probably Quaaludes, Curtis guessed. Journalists Riley and Bernstein would later report that at Dorothy's wedding reception, Dr. Kushner had handed out Quaaludes, which he kept in the glove compartment of his Rolls-Royce. Snyder skated up to the car but didn't seem to recognize Patrick. He put his hands on the car for a moment, barely taking in Curtis, his friend Richard Johnson in the passenger seat, or the two young women in the back. After a moment, Snyder skated around the car and continued on his way up toward Santa Monica Boulevard. Curtis would remember thinking, what an odd coincidence. The last time he had taken Dorothy to lunch, back in May, they had been to the Cafe Rodeo, and now, coming out of the same place, he had nearly driven into her husband. Did it mean something? Snyder certainly looked out of it. Maybe Curtis had better call Dorothy tomorrow to see how she was. But Patrick would never again see or speak with either of the two people about whom he had been troubled on that warm Tuesday afternoon. Later the same day, I drove over to the mansion for the last time. I had no idea as I drove east on Sunset to Charing Cross Road that almost exactly 2 years before, the man I was going to visit had traumatized the woman I loved. By the end of that Tuesday meeting, I realized things were not right between Hefner and me. There was a chill and stiffness in his manner I had not experienced before. I had told him at length about the glories of his Playmate of the Year, how extraordinary she was in the picture, how conscientious and cooperative she had been, how much more Hefner thought I knew, and the more I talked, the more irritated he appeared. The room turned frosty as I went on to explain how difficult the professional and personal circumstances on the movie had been. The New York streets, the producers, the two other women on the picture with whom I had once been involved, and how well Dorothy had handled everything. The mentions of Patty Hansen and Colleen Camp might have been the coup de grace, Colleen had given Playboy a hard time about naked pictures, and hadn't Hefner called me in New York to ask if Patty would pose nude for Playboy? When I had asked her, she replied, "Only if the rest of the cast does it with me." Hadn't I repeated those words with a laugh to Hefner less than 2 months before? Hefner had covered his irritation at the time by offering a big layout on the movie if I could indeed arrange a shot of all the girls nude. While I had thought he was kidding, he had probably thought, what the hell was I laughing at? Was I laughing at Hefner? Now, in his living room on August 12th, it seemed I was secretly laughing at him again as I extolled my fond association with women who had rejected him. Not realizing how guilelessly I spoke, he became more affronted when I asked if he would like to come up the block to my place in a couple of weeks and see a rough cut of the picture DR and I had made. To his way of thinking, it seemed a gross insult even to suggest he leave the Vatican West to see his very own Playmate of the Year, especially this one. Hefner stood up abruptly. "I doubt I'll have the time right now," he said with an air of dismissal. Did I care to take a look at the remodeling work Hefner had done to the private rooms upstairs? He made the invitation as though it were merely a formality. He didn't really expect me to accept, but his mood seemed to brighten when I agreed. I was surprised at what a difference this appeared to make to Hefner. It was a privileged tour of his Wonderland paradise, not to be taken lightly. He showed off the brass poles that had been specially made for his built-in clothing drawers, small reclining nude nymphs for him to admire as he dressed himself for the day or evening revels. I smiled as much as possible in admiration, but Hefner wasn't kidding. There were brass-naked women on every one of the many drawers and 3 desk areas to work on his scrapbook. He wasn't kidding about his scrapbook either. He conscientiously updated it. I had never seen it, but it had to be many tomes by now. Evidently every little thing about Hefner or Playboy from the very beginning was in there, nearly 30 years, a record reportedly more thorough than a pharaoh's. The upstairs looked quite a bit fancier than it had the one other time I had been there, more than 4 years earlier. Just after Playboy's whatever feels good philosophy had curdled Hefner's relationship with Barbie Benton. The notorious Hefner bed was as large as ever, low to the ground, with 2 giant television screens at the foot and numerous shelves stocked with videocassettes built into the surrounding walls. Although Hefner still had a certain boyish charm, he was beginning to look more sinister that afternoon than I had noticed before. I knew what this second tour of the inner sanctum meant. Dorothy and I were welcome there any time. Didn't the opulence of its appointments tempt me for a moment? Hefner began to sense my discomfort, though I tried to be enthusiastic about all of his new belongings. The tour had begun with an almost deliberate slowness, but I felt Hefner could see past my feigned expressions of admiration, especially since he now considered me a possible enemy. The speed of the tour accelerated as he seemed to read my attitude. Hefner brought up Dorothy's husband. He had sent word that Snyder wasn't to be admitted without Dorothy, so she and I could feel free to come over there any time we liked, separately or together. Of course we would, I said, but, as I had told him over the phone, we didn't want to be seen together in public. This wasn't public, Hefner said. This was private. I laughed and said that if we were seen here together, it would be all over town the next day. That was exactly what we wanted to avoid. I told him the truth. Dorothy had a lot of traveling to do. In fact, she was coming back in just a few hours, and with my daughters and her sister staying with us, the 2 of us had little free time. Hefner's attitude became one of brisk formality, and we were soon downstairs at the main entrance. I tried to keep the spirit friendly and not appear anxious to leave, but Hefner by now had turned even chillier than he had been earlier. He didn't bother to mince words. He didn't have any more time to chat, he said, and put his hand out. We shook, and I tried to pretend there was nothing wrong. Perhaps I was mistaken, I thought as I drove away. Perhaps he was simply busy. The more he thought about it, the more Hefner's sense of indignation must have become aroused. Hadn't he tolerated Stratten's husband for 2 years and given her the top prize in his kingdom? Hadn't she resisted him and his philosophy and turned her new boyfriend against Playboy as well? Hadn't Dorothy betrayed him, just as his wife had done 30 years before? Perhaps he smiled inwardly at the problems Snyder was going to give us. Bogdanovich would now have to handle the phone calls and threats and attempted deals. It was a fair assumption that there would be plenty of other chances at Dorothy Stratton.